So today I'm going to explain our tree identification lesson here at the Central Wisconsin Environmental Station. So the first things we're going to go over is our learning objectives for our lesson. And we have two learning objectives for this lesson. Our first one is that we need to identify 10 common Wisconsin trees that are found here at SWES by using a dichotomous key. And our second learning objective is to distinguish between the different kinds of trees we have here at SWES based on physical characteristics like barks or leaves or other features of the tree. So now we're going to talk about the materials you will need for the lesson. So the materials for the tree identification lesson can be found in the basement of Sunset. And all the materials will, for the most part, be in backpacks that look like this. And there's two different backpacks. The one with the white tag is for the advanced dichotomous key for older students. And the other backpack will have a green tag that houses the simpler dichotomous key for our younger students that do this lesson. So inside this backpack, we will have extra tree ID tags, which some are already out on the trees in SWES. But it's good before you teach the lesson to walk the trails and make sure that all of the cards are on the trees. And so here's just an example of one of the cards. And these cards will help students be able to see some of the characteristics of the trees. This is important because some trees might be too tall, or it might be fall or winter when you teach this lesson, and you won't have the luxury of having leaves or some of the other features you would need to properly identify a tree. For the teacher, there's also an answer key for all the different kinds of trees we have here at SWES and which tree represents which number. There's also a map for the instructor that shows the trail that you can take for tree ID and where those trees are. We also have not only a paper version, but also an overhead sheet of the dichotomous key and keying out students. Those will be used in one of your activities for this lesson. We also have vocabulary sheets as well as overheads for the vocabulary terms. And it's important that you go over all these terms so that you can teach students properly the three different kinds of branching and really explain the differences between coniferous and deciduous trees. Not to mention also knowing the different kinds of leaf margins and also knowing the difference between a simple and a compound leaf. And then we also have our two different kinds of dichotomous keys. The key I'm holding in my right hand can be used for our older students, so it's a more advanced key that has more trees on it for students to identify. And the key right here is just our simple key that we have here for SWES, and this will be used in our younger age range when we teach this lesson. We also have sheets that you can hand out to the students for them to write down which tree they identified at each letter and what they think that tree actually is. We also have this book about Wisconsin trees that can talk about any kind of tree more in depth, so if the students are interested in learning more about a specific tree, they can do that. And finally, but not least, we have these three posters that are really good visual representations of the different vocabulary terms that we're going to want to talk about with branching and coniferous trees, as well as with coniferous trees. So to introduce the tree identification lesson to the students, a good way to introduce the lesson is to really talk about the differences and similarities between what a lumberjack does and what a forester does. Keep in mind that depending on the age of your students, you might need to explain what a forester is, but it would still be good to cover that either way. And as you discuss the differences and similarities between a lumberjack and a forester, you can eventually lead to talking about how it's really important to to be able to identify different kinds of trees within both of their jobs. And this can lead right into our first lesson, where we talk about the tools of a forester, or a forester in training. And the tool that you want to talk about is really going to be the dichotomous key. So all a dichotomous key does is it asks you at each question, will ask you kind of a yes and no question, or else it'll ask you something like, does it have alternate or opposite branching? And so each question will usually have two answers, and you pick one of those answers based on the object you're looking at, like a tree, or maybe an animal, or a plant. And as you answer these series of questions, you will eventually end up identifying a specific kind of species, or a specific point, or object, like a specific kind of tree, like a red pine, for example. And as you introduce this to the students, one activity they can do using a dichotomous key is actually using the student dichotomous key. And this is a good way to kind of show an example of how you would actually use a dichotomous key, and it's a fun way to get the class involved. You can choose to have a chaperone do it, have a student do it, or even actually key out the entire class so that we can tell everyone else specifically based on going through the series of questions in the dichotomous key. So after you explain the dichotomous key and key out the different students, then you can actually hand out one of the dichotomous keys that they'd be using for identifying trees today. And you can talk about how it's similar to the student dichotomous key they just used. But you can also have this lead into our next activity, which is to introduce and discuss the different vocabulary terms that are within the dichotomous key, so that way students can properly identify the different kinds of trees that we have here at SWES. So you can either use the vocabulary sheets and hand these out to the students, and you can discuss the different vocabulary terms on the sheet, or else you can use the poster behind me here that has a really good visual representation of all the different vocabulary words that we're going to be talking about when we're talking about with our coniferous trees, our deciduous trees, as well as our branching, the different kinds of branching we have. And the nice thing is that the letters on the posters are big enough so that the students can actually have volunteers read off some of the definitions up here. It's also good that, especially with the branching, to make sure that you get examples of the different kind of branchings, and also showing some different examples of different kinds of leaves. Again, differing between pine, like coniferous trees like pine needles, and also deciduous leaves, getting broadleaf leaves from outside. And so once you've explained the vocabulary terms and you've gone through how to use the dichotomous key, you can prepare the students for going outside. And this would be a time when you can hand out your sheet, little sheet, and pens so that the students can write down what they think each tree that they'll stop at on the way out will actually look at. And make sure that the students are prepared to go outside, and make sure they get a drink of water or a bathroom before you go outside, because you will spend the remainder of the lesson then outside. On the tree identification trail, the identification trail will go outside sunset. You'll come to the first red pine here, and then you continue walking down the trail down to the sunset fireball. Then you go back up the hill, and you'll actually walk back to the cabin loop on my left here. And so this right here is an example of how all the trees on the identification trail will look like. They'll have a screen with one of the cards on here. And again, this will help students with being able to see some of the different features that they need to be able to see to identify the trees here at SWES properly. For the first tree or two, you want to make sure that you really work with students to make sure that they understand how to use the dichotomous key, and also that they're understanding some of the differences with the vocabulary terms like alternate and opposite branching, or making sure they're able to identify the different number of needles or different features of the leaf. Also, another thing that can help, especially within the fall, is that you can find leaves or pine needles on the ground, and this can also help students too with identifying the trees properly. But as you're going through this activity or part of the lesson, as you're going from tree to tree, make sure that you're giving the students more independence in actually identifying the different kinds of trees we have here at SWES. And so by the third or fourth tree, students should be actually working by either themselves or in groups to identify the different kinds of trees we have here at SWES. And so once you are close to the end of your lesson, this would be the time when you would gather all the students back together, and you're going to first review the results of the students. So make sure that they actually identified each tree correctly, and maybe ask them if they did identify a tree incorrectly, why they thought it might have been a different tree, and then tell them why they were right or wrong based on their answer. Also, during this time, for the conclusion, you're going to want to review some of the vocabulary terms that the students learned today. Also review how to use the dichotomous key to identify different things like trees or animals. Then also make sure that you evaluate if the students actually learned the learning objectives. So if they actually learned how to identify 10 different trees in Wisconsin by using the dichotomous key, and also seeing if they learned how they can differentiate between trees based on features like the bark or also on leaf characteristics.